When people talk about the best in the world, about the most intense competitions, there is no other place that comes to mind besides the Olympic Games, where the most incredible people on the planet come together to showcase their skills. However, even the strongest and most experienced athletes in the world end up making mistakes or becoming victims of truly shocking tragedies. That is exactly what we are going to see here today. A case that went down in the history of the Winter Games happened in 2010 in Canada. Just a few hours remained before the official opening when Georgian athlete Nodar Kumaritashvili, 21 years old, suffered a very serious accident during a luge training session at the Whistler Sliding Center. He was traveling at high speed, almost 144 kilometers per hour, when he lost the ideal line in the feared turn 13, climbed too high on the ice wall, and was thrown out of the track, crashing into a steel pole. The medical team arrived within seconds, tried to resuscitate him, and then took him to a hospital in Whistler, but he did not survive. The news spread quickly among the teams. Minutes later, representatives from each delegation were informed, completely changing the atmosphere behind the scenes. It was the first death of an athlete in a luge event since the beginning of the Winter Games in 1924. The accident sparked a debate about the Whistler Sliding Center track itself, considered the fastest on the circuit. In the weeks before, several competitors had already reported scares, skids, and crashes. Some even questioned whether athletes from countries with less structure were given enough training time to master such a fast course. After the shock, authorities announced temporary adjustments to the track to reduce training speeds. Even so, many people left that day with the feeling that the limits of the sport had been pushed too far and that the price paid was far too high. This tragedy happened before the competition even began. The story is about Soviet gymnast Elena Mukhina, considered one of the greatest prospects in the country in the late 70s. She started late by elite gymnastics standards, but progressed quickly. At 18 years old, she had already become world champion in Strasbourg in 1978, winning 3 gold medals and leaving even other famous competitors behind. The problem was that after that great year, the pressure for her to be the star of the Moscow Olympics increased too much. Training sessions became increasingly intense, and the wear and tear began to show. In 1979, during preparation for another championship, Elena broke her leg. Even so, with less than a year left before the Games, she was forced to return to a normal training routine without being fully recovered. She said she could barely walk, but she kept going. Around that same time, the Soviet team wanted her to master a new move called the Thomas Salto, created by American gymnast Kurt Thomas. It was considered risky even for men, because any mistake in rotation could cause the athlete to land on the neck. And that is exactly what happened. 2 weeks before the 1980 Olympics, while training in Minsk, Elena attempted the move, fell incorrectly, and suffered a cervical fracture that left her quadriplegic.
No podrá ser campeona del mundo en este aparato. Es quizá el más moderno de los que hemos visto hasta ahora.
The Soviet Union hid the case until the end of the Games. As an adult, Elena said she had warned her coach that she could break her neck. He replied that people like her did not break their necks. Years later, the move was banned. Elena died in 2006 at 46 years old, and to this day is remembered as one of the most tragic cases in the history of world gymnastics. Shortly after the Paris Olympics, in 2024, Rebecca Cheptegei, a marathon runner from Uganda who had finished the Olympic race in 44th place, became a tragic victim. At 33 years old, she was still celebrating the achievement when her life was turned upside down. In early September, Rebecca returned home after attending church with her 2 daughters, 9 and 11 years old. According to local police, her ex-boyfriend, Dixon Ndima, was already hiding on the property. Their relationship was marked by constant arguments, and family members said tensions had increased because of a piece of land recently purchased. The suspect appeared with a container of fuel and, after another argument, attacked Rebecca inside her home. She was rescued and taken to a hospital, but had burns covering a large portion of her body. Doctors tried to stabilize the athlete for 4 days, but she did not survive. The news of her death was confirmed by the Uganda Athletics Federation and also by the Kenyan Olympic team, which trained with her. The case caused an outpouring of grief among athletes in the region, as Rebecca was considered an example of perseverance. She began competing late and still managed to reach the biggest stage in sports. The suspect was also injured during the attack and was taken to a hospital under police custody. Authorities opened an investigation, and the crime reignited the debate about the safety of female athletes in East Africa. The saddest part is that the Olympic achievement, which should have been the beginning of a new chapter, ended up becoming the final chapter of the career of an athlete admired throughout the country. At a tennis tournament in Hamburg, Germany, one of the most remembered tragedies in sports history took place. In 1993, Monica Seles, just 19 years old and the absolute leader of the women's ranking, was at the peak of her career. She had just won 3 consecutive Roland Garros titles, in addition to trophies at the US Open and the Australian Open. At the time, people considered her unbeatable. But on April 30th, during a break in the match against Magdalena Maleva, Seles sat on the bench to rest. The court was full, with more than 6,000 people watching. That was when a man from the stands, Günter Parsche, approached from behind the low fence separating the crowd and tried to injure the athlete with a kitchen knife. The blade struck the area between her shoulders. She stood up in shock and staggered toward the center of the court while security finally restrained him. At first, suspicion fell on a possible connection to the war in the former Yugoslavia, since Seles was born there. But police discovered that the attacker was simply an obsessed fan of Steffi Graf, Seles' direct rival for the top ranking. Parsche reportedly said he wanted to stop Seles from continuing to win. She spent weeks treating the physical injury, but the emotional impact was far greater. Seles was away from competitions for 28 months and reported that even simple activities became painful. To make matters worse, the attacker received only probation, which outraged the tennis community. When she returned in 1995, she still managed to win the Australian Open in 1996, but she never regained the absolute dominance she had before. To this day, many people believe her career would have been even greater if that attack had never happened. During the Stockholm Marathon in 1912, one name would be forever marked, that of Portuguese runner Francisco Lazaro, a young man of 24 who carried his country's flag and the hope of returning home as a champion. Lazaro was a carpenter in Lisbon and ran because he did not even have money to take the streetcar to work. He became an athlete almost by chance, won races in Portugal, and ended up being called to represent the country in its first Olympic appearance. He arrived in Sweden enthusiastic and trained as best he could. At that time, preparation basically meant discipline and courage. But Marathon Day turned into a disaster. The race was delayed for hours because of extreme heat, which reached more than 40 degrees Celsius. Even so, the start took place in the middle of the afternoon. Lazaro began at a steady pace past the first 25 kilometers well and remained among the leaders. But near the 30th kilometer, he collapsed on a hill. He tried to get up, fell again, and was taken to the hospital. Doctors recorded severe heat stroke, followed by meningitis caused by the body's collapse. He died the following morning, never having met the daughter who would be born 4 months later. The story became even heavier when it was discovered that Lazaro's body remained in Sweden for 2 months because no one had money to bring him back. The Swedish king himself ended up paying for the repatriation. Today, Francisco Lazaro is remembered as the first Olympic athlete to die during a competition and as someone who pushed dedication to sport to its limit at a time when sports safety and medicine were still far from what we know today. Among these tense Olympic stories, there is one episode that anyone who followed Rio 2016 does not forget. It happened in the men's weightlifting final, in the category up to 77 kilograms. Everything seemed normal until Armenian athlete Andranik Karapetyan attempted to lift 195 kilograms. The movement started firmly, in a way only someone who has trained their entire life can manage. But when the weight passed overhead, something went wrong. The bar slipped backward, and Karapetyan's left arm could not withstand it. His elbow dislocated instantly, and the rest of the arm gave way in a way that shocked the arena. Coaches rushed in immediately. The event stopped, and he was taken for emergency care. At that moment, no one knew exactly how he was, only that the situation was serious. The scene became one of the most remembered moments of that edition. It was not the kind of tragedy involving loss of life, but it clearly showed how this sport pushes the body, or rather, the physical limit, to a point very few can reach. Even for an elite athlete, a single detail out of place is enough to end up in the hospital. Perhaps the 1972 Olympic Games were the most tragic of all. They took place in Munich, Germany, at a time when the country wanted to show the world it had left behind the dark past of the Second World War. Everything was designed to create a light image, with modern stadiums, soft colors, and a festive atmosphere. Even security was reduced to avoid any military appearance. And that is exactly where things went terribly wrong. In the early hours of September 5th, 8 members of the Palestinian group Black September climbed the fence of the Olympic Village wearing athlete uniforms. They carried weapons hidden in their backpacks and went straight to the accommodations of the Israeli delegation. 2 Israelis were wounded and did not survive. 9 others were taken hostage. The kidnappers demanded the release of more than 200 Palestinians who were imprisoned. German police tried to negotiate, but were unprepared to handle the situation and made basic mistakes. One of them became symbolic of the disaster. Officers positioned themselves on the roof to act, forgetting that everything was being broadcast live. That meant the kidnappers could follow police movements through a television installed in the room. At night, the hostages were taken to a military airport where a rescue attempt was supposed to take place, but the plan collapsed. There was a shootout, and in the end, all 9 hostages were killed, along with 1 German police officer and 5 members of the group. The episode became known as the Munich massacre and permanently changed how major events deal with security. To this day, it is remembered as a tragic turning point, a moment when the Olympic ideal was put to the test before billions of spectators. At the Winter Games in Pyeongchang in 2018, Japanese athlete Yuto Totsuka, then 16 years old, was competing in the men's snowboard halfpipe final when he prepared for his second run. He had secured a place in the final in 10th position. On the first run, he had already fallen and finished with 39.25 points, but it was on the second attempt that things became truly frightening. Right on the first maneuver, Yuto caught the edge of the pipe incorrectly, lost control, and fell into the center of the halfpipe. The impact was so strong that he bounced once before sliding down to the lowest part. Yuto remained lying down, unable to get up, and the medical team rushed in. He was immobilized and removed on a stretcher. Japan's team announced that the snowboarder had been taken to the hospital with hip pain, but that a more serious injury had been ruled out. The other athletes felt the shock. Fellow countryman Raibu Katayama later commented that this type of fall makes everyone more tense, because it is a reminder that any small detail can turn into a serious scare. The final continued and Shaun White won the gold, but today, when people think about that final, it is remembered more for the tension and the completely silent track during Totsuka's unbelievable fall. One of the most tense moments in weightlifting occurred during the Pan American Games in Toronto in 2015. Venezuelan athlete Genesis Rodriguez Gomez, in the category up to 53 kilograms, started very well. When attempting to lift 106 kilograms, Genesis lost consciousness and fell to the ground. For a few seconds, no one knew exactly what had happened, and many thought the bar had hit her head. Fortunately, it did not make contact. Even so, the scare was huge. The athlete lay on the platform, received medical attention, and spent several minutes off the stage. But when everyone assumed she would withdraw, Genesis came back. She took a deep breath, faced the bar again, and successfully lifted 109 kilograms. Genesis won the silver and still celebrated as if it were a major victory, considering everything she had just gone through. One of those critical moments in which many people would have quit, but she returned to the fight and because of that, left with a podium finish, almost with gold around her neck. A case that often comes up when discussing the most striking tragedies linked to the Olympic Games involves an athlete who never even got to compete. Jackson James Rice, 18 years old, was Tonga's great hope in kitesurfing and was set to make his debut in Paris. It would have been historic. He would become the first Caucasian athlete to represent the archipelago. But just a few weeks before the trip, the story took a completely unexpected turn. Jackson was diving in Ha'apai, where he grew up and where his family runs a guest house. According to his father, Darren Rice, the young man suffered what was believed to be a shallow water blackout. Other divers found him on the seabed beneath the boat. Despite rescue attempts, nothing could be done. The news shocked the entire country. Jackson had secured his spot by finishing in 8th place at a competition in Australia and was being treated as a strong candidate for Tonga's participation in Paris. And he did not only have athletic talent. At 15 years old, he had already helped save 18 people after a ferry capsized at sea. On another occasion, he rescued 2 girls who were drowning. For his family and those who followed his journey, Jackson seemed to be at the beginning of a long and promising path. Unfortunately, the Olympic dream can be interrupted in completely unpredictable ways, even before it begins. Do not forget to subscribe to watch more videos like this.